Furthermore, its interaction makes it quite likely, the way it is operated now, that if one part of it goes down, larger and larger areas will go down. For example, in the summer of 2003, in August, a sagging power line in Cleveland, as power lines will do, touched a tree branch. And after 3 or 4 hours of confusion, in a 40-second period, some 80 gigawatts, that is 80 large power plants worth of electric generating capacity, went dark, went offline. 50 million people without power in the eastern Canada and the northeastern US, billions of dollars lost to the American and Canadian economies. Now, we try to take a leaf from the book of the South Park kids there and blame Canada. But the Canadians, in their polite and laconic way, pointed out to us actually that Cleveland is south of Lake Erie, not north, and it was our damn tree branch and our power line. Now, the underlying problem is not just that chaotic events of that can occur because of the interactions and to some extent the fragility of the electric grid. The real point is that terrorists are a lot smarter than tree branches. They don't have to wait for a power line overloaded and summer air conditioning load sag down and touch them. They can figure out which transformers they ought to take out with relatively simple types of attacks. They can figure out how to hack into control systems of the electric grid. We have seen some sort of hacking or other type of malware utilization in the Stuxnet virus that has been put into the Iranian computers and systems, control systems that operate their nuclear industry. No one has yet acknowledged that they did that. It's a very interesting fact, but whoever did it, the even more interesting and somewhat troubling point is that our own control systems for our electric grid could be subject to those types of attacks. And you know, we have 18 critical infrastructures in the United States, water, sewage, etc. All 17 of the others depend on electricity. So if the electric grid goes down for a day or two or 3 or 4, a lot of people have generators, have a bit of fuel stored, you kind of get by. But for weeks to months to years, and it takes years to build these big, extremely high voltage transformers, that sends us back not into the 1970s pre-web. It sends us back into the 1870s pre-electric grid, and very few of us, even in Colorado, have sufficient horses to get around, sufficient wells and well pump handles that are manual and so forth to get drinking water. Everything goes. So we badly need an electric grid that is much more resilient than what we have now, and one that can do what is called island when there is an outage, so a local area can preserve its own electricity. Now, that doesn't mean we won't have transmission lines and we won't transmit electricity for substantial distances. Certainly we will. If you have an aluminum plant on the outskirts of town, that aluminum plant isn't going to get enough electricity to operate by what you can generate for many years locally. But if you had, through renewables and probably through some natural gas, which can scale down as well as up and is a reasonable companion to renewables such as solar, wind, and others, if you have a grid that can operate locally on what's called the distribution grid, that is the telephone poles, not requiring transmission, the big steel towers, you could at least keep going. And the difference between having some electricity and none is huge. Even if you can't keep the beer refrigerator that wastes a lot of electricity in the basement going, you only get one refrigerator and a few lights and a cell phone charger and a bit of communications, you are still at least functioning as part of civilization. With no electricity, which is a real possibility with the way things operate today, especially if there's a planned terrorist attack to take a portion of, or a major portion of the grid down. We all are in far worse situation than if we have to only have a few lights in the house and only one refrigerator and only one cell phone charger and the like. So we are vulnerable to random attacks by hackers, to intentional malicious attacks by terrorists, either hacking into the grid or using rifles, other weapons, simply to shoot transformers and damage them severely. There are other problems related to the electric grid that Patton at least thinks about. Most of us don't in our day-to-day concerns. For example, an electromagnetic pulse that could come from even a very primitive nuclear weapon such as might be launched within the next 5 to 10 years, or be able to be launched by North Korea or by Iran, could take out a very major share of the electric grid, even without causing much direct destruction by detonating at a very high altitude. And again, we are not taking the steps that we need to make the grid resilient. It is also very much on Patton's mind that oil and our dependence on oil, and not just foreign oil, our dependence on oil, period, puts us in a very difficult situation in the world. Even when oil was down around $50 or $60 a barrel, we were borrowing close to $1 billion a day just to import oil. And now with oil up in the 90s, we are borrowing something approaching $2 billion a day just to import oil. It's one of the big problems that our dollar has. Chinese are starting to advise people to stop using the dollar as the world's reserve currency. That would be a huge economic blow to the United States. But as we pile up hundreds of billions of dollars of debt every year just to import oil, quite apart from our other trade deficits, we put terrible pressure on the dollar. We also ship hundreds of billions of dollars to, as various presidents have put it somewhat delicately, countries that don't like us very much. Let me be a little blunter. 8 of the 9 largest oil exporting countries in the world are dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. Of the 22 countries in the world, they get 2/3 or more of their national income from oil. All 22 are dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. Tom Friedman of the New York Times puts this in a witty fashion in his book, Hot, Flat, and Crowded. He has a chapter on oil called Fill Her Up with Dictators. Friedman has a point. What tends to happen is that if you have a country that is already a dictatorship or an autocracy and is ruled by a small elite, when the huge income from rents from oil comes into that society, it continues to be controlled by the elites and enhances their position. It doesn't become part of a generally modern economy. If a modern democracy such as Norway or Canada discovers a great deal of oil, it doesn't turn them into a dictatorship. But a dictatorship that discovers and relies heavily on oil demonstrably tends to stay one. A number of those dictatorships have some other problems associated with them. Let me be very clear about what I'm going to say about the Middle East. I knew to some extent Abdul Rahman Wahid, the former president of Indonesia, died a little over a year ago. Marvelous man, blind in his old age, founded a group called Lib for All, and would go around Indonesia and to other countries with one of Indonesia's leading young rock stars, putting on programs for kids, praising the importance of religious liberty and tolerance and freedom. He was a devout Muslim, a Muslim who favored religious freedom. But the branch of Islam that is dominant in Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabi branch, has a different approach. Its tenets are very strongly ones that emphasize terrible brutality toward women, that emphasize hatred of Jews and Christians, emphasize the importance of killing homosexuals and apostates, and seek to point the world toward what's called a caliphate, a theocratic religious dictatorship. It is essentially the same doctrine as that of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda and the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia do not disagree on substance. They disagree on who should have power. And they hate each other and they kill each other, and to some extent the way the Trotskyites and Stalinists used to, who had a similar disagreement back in the 1920s and the 1930s. Lawrence Wright, who wrote a very fine book, The Looming Tower, about 9/11, writes for the New Yorker magazine. Wright says in The Looming Tower that with a little over 1% of the world's Muslims, the Saudis and the Wahhabis control about 90% of the world's Islamic institutions. That means for those institutions, whether they are located in Colorado, in Washington, in the West Bank, in Pakistan, or wherever, that are teaching the Wahhabi doctrine to usually little boys, because the girls go to school only a brief time. When they are teaching that Wahhabi doctrine, they are effectively teaching the same substantive doctrine as Al-Qaeda. So, the next time you pull into a filling station, if you should be thinking about public events and be musing about the question, I wonder who's paying for teaching those little boys all around the world, they're 8 years old, that they ought to long to be suicide bombers, then here's what you need to do. As you pull beside the pump to get out and take out your purse or billfold and get your credit card and charge your gasoline, before you get out of the car, turn the rearview mirror just a few inches so you're looking into your own eye. Now you know who's paying to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars a year for those institutions that teach those little boys to want to be suicide bombers. You and I are. There are some other problems with oil. In 2006, Al-Qaeda attacked Abqaiq, largest oil production facility in the world, northeastern Saudi Arabia. Had they been able to take out just a few of the big sulfur clearing towers, they could have caused 2/3 of Saudi oil to be held back for a year or more while those were rebuilt. And that would have taken half a dozen or more barrels, millions of barrels a day offline, easily sent oil well up above $200 a barrel. Happily, they rigged their truck bomb wrong. They've tried again, and this time were penetrated by Saudi and American intelligence, but it's a major tenet of bin Laden's that they should attack the oil infrastructure in the Middle East. And since most of the oil is in the Middle East, most of the oil infrastructure, of course, is also in the Middle East. So, to put it mildly, we have a range of rather serious security problems focused on oil.